But the question that I had was, in your experience, which God and subsequent argument have you encountered that you find the most challenging to refute?
I think literally none.
Until they get to that age, it's the parents' responsibility and
do
duty.
you teach them that
you may not
atheists
share
should
that.
be punished?
You may not share that, but that is my religion. That is the way I've been brought up, and I bring that child into this world. I educate him. I give him everything. It's my right to make sure that I bring him, and I take issue with that. You think that it's wicked? Well, that's your point of view. I know that's going to make him a better human being. And what's missing is when you talk about faith, you don't look at what faith teaches. First and foremost, what faith teaches is that, listen, you're a human being, so respect your fellow human beings. And I think that's the important point that you don't want to discuss.
What is the penalty for apostasy?
And that is the thing that you fail to discuss, and that's why you've got those prejudicial views about faith.
What is the penalty for apostasy? What do you teach the children will happen to them if they give up the Muslim faith?
Well, let's bring the debate back into Britain.
What is the penalty for apostasy? But what is the penalty for apostasy? What is the penalty for leaving the Muslim faith?
To be honest, I cannot back that point up.
Dr. Mukadam, what is the penalty for apostasy?
And, before...
We keep coming down this apostasy. Give us a quick answer on what is the penalty for apostasy, then we come on the audience one.
You very well know, if it's an Islamic country, then the Sharia is very clear. Apostasy is dealt with the death penalty.
Thank you, that's all I want to hear.
Because you're saying what's begging the question is the existence of the supernatural. You're saying there's no reason to believe it exists. Well, why is there no reason?
You have a question?
My question is, isn't the more conservative answer then to say that you don't know, which would be the more agnostic view? Because you appeal to conservatism.
Okay, thanks. So, isn't the more conservative answer that we don't know?
Admirably stated. We're back to terminology. Look, folks, when the atheist says, I can't believe in the supernatural, there's reasons for this. The reasons are that the reasons for the existence of supernatural, all, in the atheist's judgment, fail to yield adequate support separately or collectively. Now, if this atheist is pushed and said something like the following, look, for all you know, Mr. Know-it-all atheist, the supernatural might still be waiting there out in the darkness. My reply is, okay, I'm a humble guy. For all I know, yeah. It's logically possible that there could be something supernatural out there. It's logically possible that there's a flying spaghetti monster out there as well. If you were to ask my opinion in a lighter moment, perhaps with a pint in me, what kind of supernatural realm would best explain this crazy world we live in, I would say a committee of very angry gods. I've served on committees, they only botch the work. But enough of this lightheartedness. The agnostic has positioned themselves somehow between the supernaturalist and the naturalist. It's a very difficult no man's land to occupy. On the one hand, the agnostic seems to very cleverly make themselves seem smarter than the atheist when the agnostic says, I'm the more humble dude here in this fight. I'm telling you, I don't know whether or not the supernatural world exists or not. Now, the atheist can then reply to the agnostic, well, gee, we agree on this. We don't know that it exists. And when we don't know and we don't even have the beginnings of adequate justification for believing it exists, we don't believe that it exists. That is the default position that the agnostic and the atheist shares, and the rest is, I think, more emotional force and rhetoric that allows the agnostic to think that they're somehow smarter or more humble than the atheist. I fail to see any big difference here.
Thank you. Question from this.
Okay, my question for you is, you said that there are three ways of deducing whether or not something works in the naturalist view, and they are reason, experience, and whatever the other one was.
Science. Oh,
okay,
don't forget science, please.
The question I have to ask is, how come you disregard religious experience and our explanation for it that reason cannot explain it? How can you disregard religious experience as a valid view for the notion that God exists? So if you could just please clarify your position.
Sure. Two main reasons, and I'll be brief because I seem to be covering territory that I've covered previously. The first main reason is because religious experiences are profoundly inconsistent with each other. And by the rational principle that we ought to seek consistency, all of these inconsistent religious experiences, people claiming that they experience this God, that God, the other God, hundreds of gods. How many gods have people claimed to actually have personally experienced or had messages from? Religion encyclopedias fill shelves full of these claims down through the centuries. They're all inconsistent with each other, save where people can manage to get together and form stable churches where they can all try to kind of get their story straight, and even then it's an immense struggle. The history of Christianity is replete with churches splitting and denominations infighting over whether or not some charismatic leader accurately got a new message or revelation from Jesus correctly. We've witnessed, for example, Mormonism split off from Christianity over the argument over new revelation. The atheist can't handle all of this inconsistency. Again, they all claim to be true. They can't all be true. It's impossible to figure out which one is true. The atheist takes the conservative position that therefore, even though these experiences exist and are fascinating to scientifically study, they tell us nothing solid about the supernatural whatsoever.
I do think it's important to fight the good fight when science, when reason has vocal and powerful and well-financed enemies. And so I'm not sure what particular battles the questioner has in mind when he says we court controversy, but I suppose I believe so strongly in truth, and if I see truth being actively threatened by competing ideologies which actually not only would fight for the opposite of truth, but would indoctrinate children in the opposite of truth, I feel impelled to fight, only verbally. I mean, I don't feel impelled to actually get a rifle or something.
Yeah. Well, there's time yet. So I guess the dogma that has convinced so many fellow scientists and intellectuals, academics, that there is no reason to fight. Certainly one of those dogmas is this Stephen Jay Gould's idea of NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. And that strikes me as a purely wrong-headed and destructive idea. Do you want to explain that?
I think we probably agree about that. Non-overlapping magisteria. He wrote a book called, what was it again called? The
Rock of Ages?
Rock of Ages, that's right. So science has the age of the rocks and religion has the rock of ages, and the idea was that science and religion both have their legitimate territories, which they shouldn't impinge upon each other. Science has the truth about the real world, and that's science's department. Religion has what he described as moral questions and, I think, deep questions of existence.
Meaning and morality.
Yeah. Well, I would strongly dispute the idea that we should get our morals from religion. For goodness sake, whatever else we get our morals from, it must not be religion. That would be, and if you imagine what the world would be like if we actually did get our morals from the Bible or the Quran, it would be totally appalling. and was appalling in the time when we did get from the Bible, and is now appalling in those countries where they get it from the Quran. So don't let's get our morals from religion. As for the deep fundamental questions, I take those to be things like, where did the laws of physics come from? What is the origin of all things? What is the origin of the cosmos? What happened before the Big Bang? Those are scientific questions. It may be that science can never answer them, but if science cannot answer them, sure as hell religion can't answer them. I don't actually think anything can answer them if science can't. It's an open question whether things like the origin of the physical constants, those numbers which physicists can measure but can't explain, the origin of the laws of physics, whether those will ever be explained by science. If they are, well and good. If they're not, then nothing will explain them. The idea, I mean, Steve Gould was careful to say that these separate magisteria must not encroach on each other's territory, and so the moment religion encroaches on science's territory, for example in the case of miracles, then it's fair game for scientific criticism. But my feeling about that is that if you take away the miracles from religion, you've taken away most of why people believe in them. People believe in the supernatural because they believe biblical or Quranic stories which suggest that there have been supernatural miracles. And if you deprive them of that, then they've lost everything.
Yeah, and to take Christianity as only one example, that has been spelled out in every generation. I mean, starting with Paul, he said, if Christ be not risen, your faith is vain.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Or something close to that.
Yes.
So you can't get around the fact that religious people care about what's true, and they purport to be making truth claims about the nature of reality. They think certain historical figures actually existed. Some of them may be coming back.
Yes, virgin birth.
Books, issue occasionally from a divine intelligence, and yes. So there's just no way to.
Yes.
I never met Gould, but I just can't believe the currency this idea has in science.
I agree. It's become very fashionable among the scientific establishment. It was more or less endorsed by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. As for the separation, as for the idea that religion doesn't stray into science's territory, imagine the following scenario. Imagine that some sort of scientific evidence, perhaps DNA evidence, were discovered, perhaps somewhere in a cave in Palestine, and it was demonstrated that say, Jesus never had a father. I mean, it's inconceivable how that could happen. Just suppose it was. Suppose there was scientific evidence. Can you imagine theologians saying, "Oh, that's science. That's not our department. We're not going to." They're not going to. I mean, they would love it. It would be meat and drink to them.
Naturalism is correct?
Yes, that you cannot prove that there is no reality beyond the material world.
There's two separate questions here that have to be distinguished and carefully answered. I'll do it exceedingly briefly. Nature exists. If there's an argument against that, I haven't heard it. To argue that naturalism therefore is correct simply requires the additional view that none of the positive arguments for supernaturalism work. To declare that supernaturalism cannot be proven false is in itself not a positive argument for supernaturalism.
Now, Dr. Shook, from those two premises that nature exists and that there is no bridge to a supernatural reality, do you really think that it follows that nature is all there is?
That is the most reasonable conclusion remaining so far.
By what logical rule of inference does that follow? It seems to me that from those two premises, all that follows is we don't know if there is something beyond nature.
Let me try an analogy. Suppose, to see how my reasoning process works, let me try an analogy. Suppose you have a large sum of money you wish to invest, and I'm a broker, and I'm telling you the stock market's going up and up and up and up and up, and you say to me, well, now look, I'm pretty happy with my bank checking account. My money's really safe. give me several positive good reasons for investing it in the stock market, and I proceed to give you one after another really weak in your judgment argument, and after you get past the third or fourth one, you stop me and you say, no, I'm not going to additionally try to put my money in the stock market. I don't want my money there. You haven't given me enough good reasons.
Okay, now,
the naturalist is somebody who
look,
retains
this
belief in
exactly
nature.
illustrates my point. That person has not given you reasons to believe the stock market is going up. But that doesn't allow you anyway logically to conclude that therefore the stock market isn't going to go up or that it's going to go down. You simply have to withhold judgment. You see, it seems to me your reasoning here is logically invalid.
No, it's not logically invalid. It's simply conservative. I'm very conservative with my money.
Let's talk.
Let me again try to explain very briefly without taking up your valuable time. Look, suppose your stockbroker said, well, why are you so hesitant to invest money in the stock market? After all, you can't prove that the stock market won't go up. Should you say, well, come a day, I'm getting rich. I can't prove the stock market isn't going up. I'm going to get rich.
Come on, now, look, Dr. Shook.
That's unwise
Dr.
reasoning,
Shook,
I
please, let's be serious. The point is, the point is,
I assure you, I'm serious about
from the
money.
lack of evidence that the market will go up, it does not follow that therefore the market will not go up.
I just
but it
agreed
doesn't
to that,
follow
yes.
that it's going to go down.
I agree
and
with
yet
that point entirely.
naturalism is the view that there is nothing beyond the physical world on your definition, and you admit you cannot prove that by reason, science, and experience.
You're manipulating words. A naturalist is convinced that nature exists. Okay?
So am I.
You're asking the naturalist to additionally believe in the existence of the supernatural, and the naturalist is simply saying, give me some good enough positive arguments.
That's not
Now,
the
we've gone
definition of
back and forth
naturalism you
on the-
give. Your
sorry?
definition of naturalism is that there's nothing beyond the physical world, that there's nothing in addition to matter and energy. There are no supernatural realities. And the absence of evidence for those leaves you at best with agnosticism, not with naturalism. Naturalism cannot establish its own worldview.
Quite right. It's unfortunate that we're back to debating terminology instead of reality. Look, this business of agnosticism is a bit odd. Suppose I were to say the reason why I don't believe in the supernatural is because, I have not enough good reasons to believe in it. Now, does this make me an agnostic or an atheist? In a weird sort of way, I'm both. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. An agnostic is somebody who cannot prove that supernaturalism is false, but again, that in and of itself is not a positive reason to go ahead and jump into the
But has anybody offered in tonight's debate? Well, let's talk about the argument from the origin of the universe. I don't see that you have a whole lot here except to say that theories get modified and you attack science, the scientists because they may be wrong and so forth. Stephen Hawking in The Nature of Space and Time says this: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Do you think Stephen Hawking is misinformed or exaggerating?
I'm not a scientist, and I'm not qualified to speak to the success or failure. The community of scientists in the future, perhaps young people in this audience, will decide whether or not Stephen Hawking was 100% right or only partially right.
So you think
odds are he's probably only partially right, and it's odd for a theologian to place 100% confidence in
you're
current
committed as a
scientific
naturalist to following the evidence where it leads, right?
Okay.
Yes. So would you deny that the scientific evidence today suggests that the universe did have an absolute beginning?
It depends on what you mean by an absolute beginning.
I mean
For
that there
example,
was a point in time before which nothing existed.
Fine. If nothing existed before it, then there's no room for a supernaturalist hypothesis either, and the supernaturalist loses.
Wouldn't that be the case if
just
one
simply follows?
Okay, students, you got to listen here now. Wouldn't that be the case? Wouldn't that be the case only if the theist thought that God existed before the Big Bang?
I understand on your view that this business of before gets really exceedingly tricky.
Well, it's just that the theist doesn't think that God exists in time, and therefore he doesn't think he exists before the Big Bang. So it's perfectly coherent to say that the scientific evidence indicates the universe had a beginning, and as Hawking says, time and space came into being at that point, and that God is a transcendent reality beyond time and space.
I understand your speculative hypothesis. You've made it compatible with all available evidence. Congratulations, I'm not impressed.
All right.
Many people who are not atheists believe that your efforts against religion are wasted and that the net result of your work is to simply offend religious people. There's a widespread myth that people can't be reasoned out of their faith. Please talk about this. So there is this, it's just uncanny that there are the most memorable quips and quotes and phrases, anything that is aphoristic seems to have undue influence on our thinking. And there's this aphorism that is usually attributed to Swift, and I think he says something like it. It's not quite the version that has been passed down to us, but this idea that you can't reason someone out of a view that he wasn't reasoned into. And this just strikes the mind of Homo sapiens as so obviously true, and if you look at my inbox, it is so obviously false. So tell me about your experience reasoning with your readers.
I think it would be terribly pessimistic to think that you cannot reason. I mean, I think I'd just give up, probably die,
Right.
if I thought I couldn't reason people out of their silliness. I would accept. Would you agree with this, that there are some people who demonstrably do know all the evidence and even understand the evidence, but yet still persist in...
Yeah, well, so there'll be a couple of questions that will bring us onto that territory, because I think there's more to reason about than science has tended to allow, or that secular culture has tended to allow. So people have these intense transformative experiences, or they have these hopes and fears
Yes.
that aren't captured by you saying, don't you understand the evidence for evolution? There's just more of a conversation that people don't tend to have. But yeah, I would agree that people certainly resist conclusions that they don't like the taste of.
There are, I can think of two examples. One I mentioned in the reception beforehand. A professor of astronomy somewhere in America, astrophysics, who writes papers, mathematical papers in astronomical journals, in which his mathematical ideas accept that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and yet he privately believes it's 6,000 years old. So here is a man who knows his physics, he knows his astronomy, he knows the evidence that the universe is 13 billion years old, and yet so split-brained is he that he actually privately departs from everything in his professional life. Well, surely we have to accept that he I don't know, cannot be reasoned out, but I mean, he already knows the evidence and will not be reasoned out of his foolishness.
Yeah, I didn't say that you could always succeed, but I think, and clearly there are, I have this bias as you do, that if the conversation could just proceed long enough, the ground for science would continually be conquered, and it never gets reversed.
Yeah, and it is being and will be.
And you never see this is a unidirectional conquest of territory. So you never see a point about which science was once the authority, but now the best answer is religious.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, but you always see the reverse of that, and
that's
and
right.
that's.
And actually, most scientists who call themselves religious, if you actually probe them, I mean, they don't believe really stupid things like six-day creation and things. Most of them don't.
Yeah. Although I find that Christian scientists, not Christian scientists as in the cult, but scientists who happen to be Christian, believe much more than your average rabbi. This is a way.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, Christianity is And Muslim scientists, no doubt, return the favor.
I get the feeling your average rabbi, like your average chaplain of an Oxford college, doesn't actually believe in God at all.
I've met that rabbi.
Okay, so I understand that your definition of a naturalist is someone who bases their beliefs on science and experience, and the third one was?
Reason?
Reason, right, okay. So, and you said that basically, in a summary, being unable...
Do you have a question with this?
Yes, I do.
Okay, can you ask it?
Being unable to disprove something is not reason enough to accept it as true. That was your argument against believing in God, right?
The position I took was that the supernaturalist occasionally seems very impressed when they've been so imaginatively creative as to hypothesize a God, be it Christian or any other sort of God, that has become completely evidence-proof. In other words, there's nothing that we currently know through experience, reason, or science that could possibly prove it to be false.
Yes, and that leads to my question, is that the basis of science is that being unable to disprove something is like the opposite of that. Like everyone here, assuming you're in university, took up to grade 10 science, where we learned that science is where being unable to disprove something is reason to accept it as true. The law of gravity, the reason to believe the law of gravity is because we cannot disprove gravity. I think everyone here learned that when we were in high school.
I see the confusion here. In order to establish gravity as the most plausible explanation, other hypotheses have to be tested and therefore ruled out as wrong. And that has been very successfully done in favor of the theory that there's a mutually attractive force between any two objects with mass. No other hypothesis that human beings have come up with and tested has been able to adequately explain experimental results. So what we have here is a case of one theory surviving experimental testing. Now, the analogy to religion would be as follows. If religion were in a mood to try to appeal to evidence in a similar way, the various supernaturalist hypotheses would have to undertake the task of making predictions about new things that would be discovered within nature, and then scientists would go out and investigate whether or not those things could in fact be found, and the supernaturalist hypothesis that garnered the most correct experimental predictions while suffering no falsifications would emerge, you see, as the winner. Theology can do this and used to do it in prior centuries, but scientific hypotheses postulating only natural forces, energy, mass, these sorts of things, have consistently proven to be far more persuasive and reasonable for things happening within nature. Evolution sort of was the last straw. So what we have here is a case of reasoning and science demanding, first, are you willing to put your hypothesis under rigorous experimental testing? Modern day theology at the edges doesn't do this anymore. It simply takes whatever science manages to know about nature and then complain that there's still more mystery. We heard much of this tonight. So theology, you know, the analogy between theology and science breaks down completely. I hope this helps clear up a little bit for you how reasoning and science and theology could or should work.
And a question for Dr. Shook.
Hello, Dr. Shook. Thank you for being here. First of all, if there's a God, could be a she, could be a he, just throwing that out there. Okay, so you said right at the very beginning, we're all atheists about thousands of God. You're just one more ahead of the believer. What do you have to say to the argument that was not brought up in this debate, that the presence of thousands of gods throughout history, throughout cultures, suggests that there is a God?
Fascinating. This is a variation on the argument from the consent of humanity, as John Stuart Mill might have put it in the last century. In other words, the idea is if, all of humanity or most of humanity agrees on X, who are we now to dispute it? Of course, one major difficulty with just accepting anything that collective humanity currently says is that if that were our procedure, science would have never gotten off the ground and we'd still be living in caves. Human beings have collectively believed a wide variety of bizarre speculations about nature and how nature works, but science has undergone the very hard work, and scientists have consistently been in the minority of human beings on this planet with their advanced new theories, and they suffer terribly for it. They suffer from persecutions in less enlightened countries, still controlled by dogma and priestly authority. They suffer in our own, if we want to call it advanced civilization here nowadays, because common people complain it's very hard to understand sophisticated things like quantum mechanics and Big Bang cosmology. So the poor suffering scientists, But we do depend on science, and we can't always just accept what humanity happens to agree at a particular point of time. That can put the naturalist in a very difficult position. You might anticipate me. You might say, well, now, didn't you just now, Dr. Shook, claim that we ought to be humanists because many great civilizations and many great world religions have been gradually evolving towards the view, as Dr. Craig so eloquently put it, that human beings all deserve, dignity and intrinsic value. Well, the difference is that when humanity collectively has struggled so far and so long for beliefs that are of immense benefit and practical value to all of humanity, that's, if you will, the sort of pragmatic test, we should have some confidence that we're on the right track. Does belief in the supernatural pass the same test? Do priestly authorities, dogmatic creeds, churches running governments, kings proclaiming divine authority still have practical value for the advancement of civilization? I think the fact that the 20th century has witnessed the march and progress of democracy says no, I don't think we're going back. So we must intelligently winnow out things about which humanity seems to be making progress and things about which humanity has simply been mistaken.
I would like to ask you, Professor, what do you have to say to someone who has met the risen and living Lord Jesus Christ, who has walked with God for over 50 years, who received the anointing of the Holy Spirit with the same consequences as the early apostles in the book of Acts? Sir, what do you have to say? Because I assure you, for my life, it has been no delusion.
If you had been born in India, I dare say you would be saying the same thing about Lord Krishna and Lord Shiva. If you had been born in Afghanistan, I dare say you would be saying the same thing about Allah. If you had been born in Viking Norway, you would be saying the same thing about Wotan. If you had been born in Olympian Greece, you'd be saying the same thing about Zeus and Apollo. The human mind is extremely susceptible to hallucination.
Will you come back on that subject?
Sir, I'm being allowed by the friend I used to work with to come back. I cannot afford to build my life on hallucination, but on Jesus Christ, who is the rock. And it is that I have asked you to address, please.
You are obviously sincere, but obviously I do not share your beliefs, and I think you are hallucinating. That's all I can say. I don't doubt your sincerity.
So there's basically, what I learned is there's basically two big producers in Hollywood of Christian films. And one is the kind of down and dirty cheap ones, and one is the main studio big ones. So the down and dirty ones are all made by this place called Pure Flix. And the first one that came out is God's Not Dead. Now, how many of you have seen God's Not Dead? Oh, so there's some of you. Okay. Okay, if you want to be depressed / totally entertained, you should rent God's Not Dead. So God's Not Dead is all about this professor who's sort of like Richard Dawkins, except it's not at all like Richard Dawkins. And this young kid goes to college and he takes Philosophy 101. And the teacher on the first day says, you've got to sign a paper saying that God is dead. Because God is dead, and I'm not even going to teach this class unless you accept that God is dead. And everyone in the class sheepishly writes God is dead, except for this one kid who says, I can't sign that paper, and not only that, I'm going to debate you in 3 debates and prove to you that, that God is not dead. And the way, of course, all the atheists in the movie, there's 3 main atheists in the movie, and they're all showed as such crazy God-hating villains. Like, every single one of them isn't really an atheist. They're just mad at God. And so, for example, the professor, at one point, the student says, why do you hate God so much? And the professor says, because he took everything away from me that I loved. Oh, my God. And then the other atheist in the movie is this horrible, he just cares about making money, and he's mean to his girlfriend. When she tells him that she has cancer, he dumps her right during the same dinner because he's an atheist. That's what they do. And his mother has Alzheimer's and was a Christian, but he doesn't take care of his mother, even though, she needs care. And there's this great scene where he goes to his mother, and she's sort of blankly watching the TV screen that's just like, sand on the TV screen. And he says, Mom, I'm an atheist, and I just love to make money. And you've prayed and believed. This is the kind of writing, I just want to say. You've prayed and believed your whole life, and you've never done anything wrong. And you're the nicest person I know. And I'm the meanest, angriest person I know. You know how mean, angry people are always just making that announcement. And now you have dementia, but my life is perfect. Why don't you explain that to me? And then his mother suddenly comes out of her dementia for this one moment. You know how that happens with people with dementia, when they're suddenly click in. And she says, sometimes the devil allows people to live a life of trouble because he doesn't want them to turning to God. Your sin is like a jail cell, except it's nice and comfy, and there doesn't seem to be any need to leave. The door's wide open till one day time runs out and the cell door slams shut. And suddenly, it's too late. And then she turns to him and says, excuse me, who are you anyway? Oh my God! Okay, you guys, this movie was made for $2 million and it's made $140 million. And it actually started this whole company, Pure Flix, that now has made many, many of these films. And let me just say, the overall point of all these Pure Flix films is not even about Christianity. No one ever really talks about what it means to be a Christian or any difficulty being a Christian besides saying, I love Jesus, and that's the end of it, and your life's great. It's really all about vilifying secularists. It's all about saying that secularists are terrible people. That's the whole point of the movie. Okay, so then because that was so popular, they had to make God's Not Dead 2. I thought at least it could be TOO or something like that. No, it's just God's Not Dead 2. And that was made for $5 million. It's so far made $23 million, not as much, but still pretty good return on that money. Okay, Annie, Laura, and Dan, you might be in the wrong business. All right. No, they're not. Okay, so God's Not Dead 2 stars Melissa Joan Hart. She's a teacher of history in a public school. And she tries to keep her Christianity to herself. And her father is played by Pat Boone. I'm not kidding. And in her class, they're talking about violent resistance, and she's talking about MLK and Gandhi. And then a girl in the class whose parents are atheists which means that their son died 6 months before, and they had no feelings about it. That's how you can tell. And she raises her hand and says, wasn't Jesus a pacifist? And Melissa Joan Hart goes, you can tell she knows she's not supposed to mention Jesus' name in the public school. She says, according to the writers of the Bible, Jesus did say, love your enemies. And all of a sudden, of course, she's broken the rule. She's mentioned Jesus, and she's hauled before the school board, and they say, you know you're not supposed to mention Jesus in a public school. And she says, but I was asked a question, and I was just teaching history, and he's historical. And they followed him, and they said, we need you to sign a statement saying, I've made a horrible mistake. And she says, she has a statement like, I'd rather be fight with God against the world than be with the world and fight against God. Okay, then the girl's parents, the girl who asked the question, they say, I can't believe they said the word Jesus in your history class. We're going to get the ACLU on this case and make millions of dollars suing the school. And now you're going to get into an Ivy League school, daughter, because you're going to be a famous girl who had this case about the horrible teacher who said Jesus in the classroom. Pat Boone so then Melissa Joan Hart goes home to her father, Pat Boone, who says things, that's the thing about atheism, they take away the pain. They don't take away the pain, they just take away all the hope. Oh, this is my favorite Pat Boone quote in the whole of God It's Not Dead 2. They seem to forget the most basic human right of all is the right to know Jesus. It's like, really? That's the most basic human right of all. But you guys, this is what we're up against. Okay. Oh, God. Oh, and then it's so funny because the atheist parents just don't care about their son that's died. They like, our son died 6 months ago. We boxed off his stuff. Daughter, the Salvation Army's coming over soon. Can you just give them all this stuff that, that your brother had? And she's like, oh, okay. And then the Salvation Army comes and they find a Bible in the son's room. He was a Christian. They didn't know it.
I was actually interviewed by a Bill O'Reilly wannabe from New Zealand, and I just wanted to quickly take this opportunity to say that I don't think that Christians are stupid, but I do think that even very smart people can believe false things. Now that that's cleared up, the title of my talk is A Fresh Generation of Freethinkers is Among Us, and I hope that I'm going to inspire you by sharing with you some of the stories of a relatively new student-based grassroots movement in Australia that is mobilising young people to be advocates for science, reason and secular values. To start, let me give you a little bit of a picture about my background, tell you my story, how I became president of the University of Melbourne Secular Society, and then with a group of other students found the Free Thought Student Alliance. I was raised in a fairly irreligious household. Although my parents were Anglican, I was sort of raised to believe that there was a God and there was a heaven and a hell, but it was sort of around the same time I was told that there was an Easter Bunny and a Santa Claus, and I think when I figured out that those things weren't real, it probably did cast a bit of a doubt in my mind about those other things. But all in all, I never really had to think about religion too much. I think it's one of the privileges of growing up in Australia, which is a largely secular population. Unless you're unlucky, you can probably live most of your life without having too many run-ins with religious belief. And I remember when I was young asking my mum why we didn't go to church, because they went to church on The Simpsons, and she said, well, church is on Sunday, you play football on Sunday, so what would you rather do? And that was a no-brainer for me. So I guess in my teenage years, religion wasn't on my radar. I never felt the urge to find out whether or not any of it was actually true. I think maybe, as Sam pointed to earlier, I think I was actually a little bit afraid that maybe when I died that was the end, so I didn't really want to think about it. And also it was kind of nice to feel that maybe there was some being out there looking out for me in his mysterious ways. But that all changed for me when I was 17 and I went on student exchange in the United States of America. I was situated in the state of Kansas, which is kind of like the buckle of the Bible Belt. Home of Westboro Baptist Church. I was there in 2005 when they introduced intelligent design into the high school biology curriculum, and they voted overwhelmingly to ban gay marriage. And so it kind of gave me a window into the effects that religion can have on a society when they take it really seriously and really literally. So believe it or not, I went to youth group twice a week. I went to church. Some people say, well, you know, if you're not really religious, why did you go along to that? But going on exchange is all about experiencing a different culture, and going to church is just what they did there. And so I was more than happy to go along. In my first youth group, the pastor actually got up and said, it's generally understood that the world is about 6,000 years old. And I looked around and people were nodding, and I thought, I was pretty sure I'd read that it was older. And I actually turned out to be the only kid in my school who believed in the theory of evolution. I had never studied biology before. I was pretty sure it was a scientific fact, but I wasn't really sure. And so it was this experience that galvanized me to read up on it as much as I could. And I didn't really care what the answer was. What I cared about was what was true for the first time. And during this process, I had to teach myself how to think critically, how to evaluate the claims that I was hearing, and eventually over time I came to understand and appreciate science like I never had before, and realize that it was really the best tool, the best process for figuring out the reality of the world that we live in. Upon returning home to Australia, I thought I was probably the only Australian who felt strongly about these issues. Also, all of a sudden, my eyes were open to the effects that religion was having on our society that I'd never noticed before, and I was kind of determined to sort of do something about it. So when I started up at the University of Melbourne, we had 13 religious clubs on our campus and a Christian union that had a really pervasive presence. I think, you know, when I was at university, I felt that it should be a secular institution, sort of a bastion of actual knowledge, but students couldn't really get from one class to another without knowing when their next Bible study was, whether it was the chalk on the ground or the posters on the wall or the flyer you were handed. And I eventually figured out that I wasn't the only student on campus who felt that perhaps it was time to start up an alternative group for non-religious students. In fact, I didn't realize this, but a few students had actually set up a table on campus, grabbed a copy of The God Delusion, put that on one side, grabbed a bit of paper for people to write their email address, put it on the other, and they collected like 30 email addresses within the space of an hour from people that walked by and saw it and said, whatever they're doing, I want to be a part of that. So eventually, with those 30 emails, we had enough people to actually start up the club, and we affiliated, and we came up with a set of aims, and I just want to read them to you quickly. One, to encourage freedom from superstition, irrationalism, and dogma, to further the acceptance and application of science, reason, and critical thinking on campus and in the wider community. To stimulate debate surrounding ideas of religion, science, philosophy, politics, and ethics. To defend the separation of church and state, individual freedoms, and civil liberties for all persons, regardless of race, sex, gender, class, creed, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and disability. To create a united campus community for free thinkers, skeptics, atheists, agnostics, and humanists in the pursuit of these common goals. So come orientation day, we signed up about 300 students to be members of our club, making it one of the largest non-faculty-based clubs on campus. We held a mixture of sort of social as well as educational events. On the social side, we held pub nights and parties and tried to build a community of free thinkers and help like-minded people to connect to one another. I think one of the accusations against secular youth is that we're not particularly engaged in the community and we don't participate in charity work. And statistically, it actually backs that up. We don't. But I don't think that's because of a lack of compassion. I think it's because we lack the infrastructure that the church setting provides to actually get involved in those things as our religious youth do. And so that was another thing that we wanted to sort of build and operate on campus, was a sense of atheists getting out there as atheists, doing a bit of community work and use the infrastructure that the university provided to get people together and participate in that.
Last week we established that most of us, like Richard Feynman, would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And today I still have questions about the Bible's consistency that just make no sense whatsoever. And I'd like to see if perhaps the occasional Christian apologist that makes his way or her way into my videos can provide even semi-satisfactory answers. Let's dive in, man. Now, this first one, I've never actually understood it at all, but I suspect it might be due to my non-familiarity with all Christian traditions. According to the Bible, Jesus died on the cross and spent 3 days in the afterlife to pay for sins in the world. Now, if that is true, then why would we still have to go to hell ourselves to pay for our sins a second time, in case we die sinners? And if Jesus' sacrifice wasn't worth enough to ensure our entry into the pearly gates of heaven, then why should we care at all that he died for our sins, man? Doesn't his sacrifice in this case mean nothing? That's it, I might have missed something in the Christian tradition, so please, Christian apologists, enlighten me, man. Moving on. Now, I recently came across this question on a Reddit post, and I couldn't believe that I'd never thought about it myself. Now, you've all heard of Thomas, Jesus' disciple. The Bible makes it clear that he was a skeptic, and even though he had walked with Jesus and witnessed his miracles with his own eyes, he still had his doubts in the end. And after the crucifixion, Thomas even had to require physical proof to believe that it was indeed Jesus who had risen from the grave. The Bible then tells us that Jesus allowed him to touch his hands and feel the holes in his hands in order to restore his faith, basically. So it is safe to assume that were it not for Jesus providing this proof, Thomas would have remained a skeptic and therefore a sinner not worthy of admittance into heaven. I hope we're really together up to that point, man. So today my question is simply, why doesn't Jesus, who is God according to Christians, extend that same proof to skeptics around the world, man? Those of us who doubt his existence are no different than Thomas, who was literally a disciple of Jesus himself and still couldn't believe it, man. Just imagine if Thomas had been born one generation later and hadn't had the chance to receive this divine confirmation from Jesus himself. He'd certainly be burning in hell for all eternity for not believing. And that's actually not the only thing. Let's take a look at Paul, who was born after the birth and ascension of Jesus Christ. Throughout Paul's life, not only did he not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but he also went as far as persecuting and murdering Christians under the impression that Christianity was a dangerous belief system to practice. As the story goes in the Bible, a flash of light came out of the sky and Jesus Christ himself appeared to Paul, explaining to him that he is indeed the one true God. From that point onwards, Paul became a converted and devout Christian. And again, ladies and gentlemen, if God was willing to go out of his way to physically prove to Paul and Thomas that he exists, then why isn't he willing to extend the same grace to those who doubt him today and show them the exact amount of physical proof? Basically, if God is indeed a just and fair God, then why does he see it fit to save some people from eternal damnation and not others, man? Why should atheists and agnostics, or those who do not believe in other religions, be any different from Thomas and Paul? Okay, next question, man. Now, this next one isn't as much a confusing question about the Bible as it is a disappointment in myself for somehow missing it, man. Growing up, one of the most important verses in the Bible, or so it seemed in our churches, was the story of Abraham. We even had countless songs about the gentleman. And the specific thing that was captivating about the story of Abraham was his commitment to his faith in God. He was even willing to sacrifice his own own son to appease the Lord, if you guys remember. But the Lord, in his full glory and capacity for mercy, jumped in at the last minute and stopped Abraham from driving a blade through his son. So basically the moral of the story was that we should all aim to have just as much faith as Abraham, and we should always remember that God, unlike other low-life gods and demons, is a merciful God and would never let us hurt the people that we love in his name. I can actually even vividly remember a preacher in my country, Kenya, admonishing traditional African cultural practices because one of the tribes here reportedly performed a human sacrifice back in the 18th or 19th century. So, guys, can you imagine my absolute horror and disappointment in myself when I learned that the God, our Lord, like the lowly traditional African gods, is a fan of the occasional human sacrifice, man? I know most of you have heard the story already, which is the story of Jephthah, the Israelite judge who promised God that he would offer as a burnt sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house if God gave him victory in the upcoming battle. He went on to indeed be victorious in his battle against the Ammonites. And when he returned home, his daughter was the first one to come out and meet him. Then the daughter, after learning the promise that Jephthah had made to the Lord, asked for a 2-month grace period to go out and have fun with her friends, after which the Bible says Jephthah did to her as he had vowed. Despite the Bible clearly indicating that he did to her as he had vowed, modern Christians have tried to whitewash the passage basically and try to insinuate that perhaps Jephthah only gave her daughter to the house of the Lord as a servant instead of actually sacrificing her. Which is a bunch of bullcrap, man, because not only is that not indicated anywhere in the Bible, but also in the Hebrew Bible, the same word for burnt offering, which is used in reference to Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11 verses 31, was also used in other biblical passages about human sacrifice, like the story of Isaac and his father Abraham, as well as the story of Mesha and his son Moab in 2 Kings 3 verses 27. So what's up with all this, man? And now, to close up this conversation, why will God give us the capability of logic and reason and expect us not to use it when it comes to belief in him and his word? Most, if not all people with an ounce of belief in God must have been scared for my sake at some point through this video, man. How dare this dude question the word of God like that, man? Doesn't he understand that God can be a wrathful God? And you know what? I do not blame them, man. The one thing that was hammered into our brains while growing up in religious homes was the idea that the worst thing you can do, apart from claiming that God doesn't exist, is question his will, man. And if any of this has any ounce of truth, then why would God create us with the capacity for logic and reason? Is it just one of his many traps or what? A few years ago, I actually remember seeing a trending post on Twitter where the post basically asked, imagine you're stuck in a freezing wilderness and your fire is about to blow out. Your friends have gone out to get more wood, but they're unlikely to make it back in time before the fire blows out. The only flammable material you have with you that can keep the fire going until your friends get back is your Bible. Now, will you tear out the papers and use them to keep the fire alive, or will you take your chances in the cold and hope that God comes to your rescue? Would you guys like to guess the percentage of people who picked the latter? It was a disappointing majority, I can't tell you that much, man. And as Bertrand Russell said, religion is based primarily upon fear. It's partly the terror of the unknown and partly the wish to feel that you have a kind of elder brother who will stand by you and all your troubles and disputes.